Thank you very much for having me. Particularly thanks to the MSF team allowing me to come up here and talk to you about the journey that we've been on with Walk to Work motion compensated gangway design assurance. My name's Jim Brown. I'm the Global Discipline Head for Maritime Design Engineering with Shipping and Maritime in the Shell Group. I'm not a Walk to Work expert. I have a fantastic team of marine engineers, naval architects, electrical engineers, nautical advisors who do design, support and assurance for our projects. They've all managed to make themselves conveniently unavailable. So I've been left with the task of trying to present our story. And it's a story, but it's also a request for help from the industry, help from yourselves, whether you're a vessel operator, an OEM, a manufacturer of walk-to-work equipment, a charterer, classification societies, regulators. Because I see the gaps that I'm going to talk about is something that can't be solved individually. We need to kind of work together to solve these issues. Just a bit of an agenda. I'm just going to talk about the case for action, and one of the key points is why I'm standing here today. The assurance approach we're using, and we are doing the assurance just on the design. Operations is kind of a separate area, but the piece of work that we're doing is just on the design. What are the kind of findings that we found doing this? So I'll explain some of those, show some examples. And really then this request for help, to collaborate as an industry to help address these things, because it's not easy, and it is novel technology. It's only 10, 15 years old at most. We're all still learning, but there's some significant issues out there that we need to get after. And then I say questions and answers. I don't probably know enough to answer any questions, but maybe I'll ask the questions and seek some help from the subject matter experts in the room. Just a couple of small print, that's the word. Just anti-competition. We are talking about vendors, equipment, so I'm not going to use vendors' names. We need to make sure we're not sharing competitively sensitive information, talking about prices or anything like that. And just a disclaimer here, which effectively says, don't believe a word I'm saying. Please do your own research before you sort of make decisions based on this. So, as most of you are aware, walk-to-work systems have been growing in popularity. They provide a safe means of access, and they are much safer. Despite the challenges I'm going to talk about, compared to the alternatives, they do provide a really good opportunity for safe transfer of personnel. So I don't want to lose sight of that. They allow increased operability, more uptime, and are cost-effective compared to other means of transfer. So they are growing in popularity, and with that growth comes challenges. So new entrants coming onto the market, but also just the exposure hours. If you think about the number of people, the number of hours that people are spending crossing those gangways, the things which you think would never happen as a designer, you do happen just due to the exposure that happens with number of people using the equipment. The safety challenges and risks. I mean, if you review the UK HSE safety notice, the EDO2 from 2024, it highlights entrapment, man overboard, and asset damage. These are the same things that we've identified as we've sort of started off from our blank sheet of paper doing our assurance. The industry codes, the industry standards and class codes, so classification societies who are providing that design assurance, they're on a learning journey themselves as well. They've been part of the journey. They've developed codes and standards. They're updating them. But there's a lot of subjectivity when it comes to design. There's a lot of paradoxes that we need to work through, and there's a lot of different interpretation of some of those functional requirements when equipment is being designed. Also, there are originally the equipment was designed against offshore lifting codes rather than specific codes for offshore gangways. So that created some gaps in the early days. And of course, once a manufacturer creates a system, it could be in use for 10, 15 years. So even as codes get updated, there's a long lag period before that improved design comes to market. The reason I'm standing up here in particular is because it's something that is very close to my heart, because we were involved, we were the responsible for an incident in the North Sea on our watch where it was resulted in a life-changing injury. As we've been looking into the incidents across the industry, we're not alone. I'll talk through our assurance process, but the starting point was looking at all of the various incidents and then trying to identify the various root causes from across the industry. And there was about 60 that we managed to get hold of. We recognised there was a lack of information about the incidents, and therefore, if we're not able to share those incidents with classification societies, with the manufacturers, we're going to struggle to learn and to improve. So we've got HSE regulatory notices. The ED02 was around making it clear that the responsibility for making sure that the equipment was suitable for its purpose. That came out in 2024. And then more recently, the time delay before an auto retraction. And this was very timely because this was something we identified as well as we were engaging with vendors, assessing their equipment. We identified that this was a problem, and it was good to see that the UK HSE also identified this. So the assurance approach we used was to take a blank sheet of paper. The initial focus was on the entrapment risk, but we realised there could be other aspects out there which needed for the design to be assessed against. So we reviewed about 60 different incidents. We identified what were the design elements that impacted that risk, and then how does the classification society standards address that risk? And of course, the realization is classification society codes are kind of the baseline. They're the minimum standard. But to be a prudent operator, prudent charterer, prudent owner, we need to go above that. So we looked to see what those classification society codes covered, and then kind of what was the gap. And then we developed a list of sort of questions to go and assess, and then we engaged with the equipment vendors to see whether that gap existed in their equipment. There's no point to us redoing the areas that classification society codes were already covering. We were just trying to find out where was the gap and then go after that gap. So these were the kind of areas we identified. So the risk areas: entrapment and crush injury. I mean, that was obviously quite an obvious one. But what we found there was that it's like a classification society would say, do a risk assessment, identify where your sort of entrapment areas are, and that was it. So there's a lot of subjectivity there, and we see that entrapment happens. And going back to this point that with the exposure hours, you can end up with people in situations where as a designer, you'd never think about how they could get there. How could that happen? But of course, as we know, people, when you think of it with your sort of human performance lens on, looking at it from a human-centered design perspective, people are people. They make mistakes, or they are influenced by an environment which is varying all the time, they get themselves into that situation where the entrapment can occur. Some of the classification society codes refer to ISO standards about gaps, but they're not really appropriate for, they're talking about sort of machinery where you put guards in front of machinery to prevent hands going in there. It doesn't really, it's very hard to interpret what that means from a gap perspective for a gangway. So just an example here, some of the entrapment risks. You've got the distance between the sliding steps, so the transition between the telescoping boom and the main boom. That gap there, that's where safety shoes can get caught in between. You've got gaps between the sliding handrails and again, between the telescoping boom and the main boom. You've got exposed wheels, open gaps in the handrails. So, we recognise that there was some really good best practices that some of the OEMs had incorporated into their designs. Things like the cone plate, which is, if you look at an escalator, the way that the stairs meet the moving part meets the static part, that cone plate prevents any kind of gap there for someone to get entrapped in. We found one of the situations we looked at was where someone tripped and their hand went through the main boom's stanchion, whilst the telescoping boom was moving backwards, trapping that arm. But if they have guards on the inside, then that would prevent that. We've seen, lighting, having good lighting that is always stays on the transition step. The wheels, exposed wheels, was an issue. Putting guards onto those wheels, all that thing helped. So I think in this area, just requiring OEMs to do a risk assessment wasn't enough. I think there's an opportunity to be more prescriptive about what these gaps need to be. So I really felt that there was an opportunity there. The APS, the automatic protection system, or the automatic retraction, what initiates that? We found there was big variation in the requirements there. So if the APS operates due to a failure of a single critical component, it's a redundant. If it has sufficient redundancy, it doesn't need to retract immediately. You can have a delay to make sure that the operator can make sure that the personnel transferring reaches a safe position. The telescoping speed, again, this is a balance. It's not easy to say what should be the limit of that speed. You want it to be slow enough so that from a human factors engineering perspective, it's not going to, or it's going to reduce the risk of someone falling over or having that telescoping boom come towards them and hit them. But you also don't want it to be too slow so that as your vessel drifts on towards the asset, it's not able to pull away quick enough and result in contact. So again, it's these things that are not easy, and I think we need to come together and try to work out what is that the optimum prescriptive requirements for these. I know Lloyd's originally had a 0.5 meter per second limit. They've realised that's not it's not workable. They've increased that to 1 meter per second. Redundancy philosophy. This was a big one. So we've seen some of the OEMs have really good redundancy. So all of the safety critical components, electrical and instrumentation components, they are redundant. In the event of a failure of one of those, you get an alarm, you can stop transfer, the system still operates for a period, and then you can safely retract. But there is equipment out there which has no redundancy. The manufacturer says, we don't need to make it redundant, because if anything fails, the APS will just operate immediately and create, and that will create a safe situation, which of course it doesn't. If people don't have sufficient time to clear the gangway, to follow the emergency response process, to grab the handrails, to seek guidance from the operator, if they don't have time to do that, to move off the tip, then that's going to result in those man overboard situations. And the FMEAs, so the FMEAs are really key in understanding how that redundancy philosophy has been incorporated into the design. We've seen a big variation in the quality of those FMEAs, and how have they been assured by a third party? We've seen some FMEAs that are 2 pages and they tell you nothing. So yeah, that redundancy is really key. The emergency operational time, so there's this, again, another sort of paradox where if you have a redundant system, a component fails, it can still operate because it's a redundant component, but you don't want to operate in that condition, so you allow it to by design you allow it to operate for a further period, and then it retracts. And then the question is, well, if I've got people left on the platform, should I be allowed to operate it for a short period in that compromised situation? And that's something we need to land. Is that appropriate? Are you creating more risk, or are you managing risk by allowing you to do that? And should that be hard-coded into the design so it's not abused? Or do we use operational procedures to make sure that we're not operating for long periods in non-emergency conditions in a compromised situation with only with a component that's out of action? User familiarization. I know it's not really design, but it's something that comes up again and again. We see huge difference in as you mentioned there, difference in the safety procedures from manufacturer to manufacturer, but also from a particular manufacturer that's upgraded their system, or they've changed some components, or they're talking about a different model, and yet their training material has not been updated, or it's showing a different model, or it's showing a different design. And this really comes into this sort of human performance area. We've seen like instructions that say, hey, grab, when you have the audio and visual alarm, grab both handrails, but the gangway is 1.4, 1.6 meters wide. They can only hold one of them. And another point, which we thought was really interesting, was a lot of the instructions say, when that alarm goes off, because an APS is about to activate, grab the handrails and seek instruction from the operator. That sounds great in theory, but what actually happens in reality is that so imagine that person's on the main boom, the APS is operating, they follow the instructions, grab the handrails, operator. They look to see what the operator's going to tell them to do, and of course that telescoping part of the gangway is now coming towards them with potentially up to 10 kilometers an hour. That's how an accident's going to happen. So we need to do something on that user familiarization, as Ewan mentions. So this was originally called questions and answers, but I'd really like to hear from you guys as to what you've experienced, thoughts you have, so could we put the...
That went quicker than I was thinking. Right, anybody, any comments, questions, input? Got one down here.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Just a question on the scope. Was Shell looking at it from both oil and gas and renewables perspective, or is this focused on one or the other?
We were just looking at motion compensated gangways, walk-to-work systems in general, just the design. So we didn't really matter how they were being used. Obviously, the majority of that was in oil and gas sector.
And the other thing that occurred to me, I'm not a DP expert, but you were talking about the operation of the system when it's in a degraded condition. And I don't know if you had discussed with your DP experts around their processes and protocols for operating in a degraded condition, in a degraded DP condition.
Yeah.
Maybe something there.
We haven't actually, so that is a good point. But yeah, no, fair point. Thank you. Yeah, because it's a very similar situation, isn't it? You're operating in that degraded condition. How can you define the procedures that allow you to operate for that and getting clear on that? So yeah, good point. Thank you.
Hiya, quick question from me. You've highlighted some issues with the gangways. I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how the workforce feels in using them? Because you've highlighted some challenges. Is anybody nervous about it, and how do you tackle that as an operator when there's still a job to be done?
I'm sorry, could you hold the microphone just a bit?
Yeah, so you've highlighted some challenges in using the gangways. I'm just wondering how the workforce feels about using them, because they're fairly new to our industry. There are some challenges and some risks in using them. How do you know, or what's your feeling of how the workforce feels about using them, and how do you tackle that as an operator when you've still got a job to do when you're out there?
Yeah, so I've got to be honest, because we were looking at it from a design perspective. Operations, we didn't really look into operations. The only thing we realized was we needed the feedback from users into the design. But anything to do with operations, I'm sorry, I can't answer, but I'm sure there's other people in the room that may be able to help with that. John?
Yeah, in answer to that question, I mean, one of the areas where we've had issues with gangways has been the Far East. What we've seen there, they're transitioning from a method of transfer of, I use the term swing ropes, which sounds as though people are swinging. Not exactly the case, but using a rope as a point of contact, and then transitioning to use of gangways. It was met very positively there. But the reality is, in terms, since we've widespread been using MCGs, there we've had 2 serious incidents, whereas we'd have to go back about 8 years to have the similar number on swing ropes. I think the bottom line is people can become overconfident, complacent in the use of these gangways, not understanding the risks because it looks modern. It looks safe, whereas reality is just seen numerous hazards. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'll maybe just feed in a bit on that one. We had that same question put to us about, ultimately it's down to the people using the equipment. I would like to say by and large that most of our technicians that are going across are happy and comfortable. But we need to keep, so drawing that comparison back to the airline industry and getting that briefing every single time we step on a plane. We do that for our technicians every time they board the vessel. They're made to sat down, we go through the briefing specific to that vessel and that gangway that's fitted there. We'll leave our layer on top of that, we'll take them up to the bridge and we'll show them the gangway physically going into alarm once they're in the field. We'll do a drift off test so that they can see and hear what's going to happen if that alarm goes off. But there's definite improvements that can be made.
So I can follow up on that as well. We ran a campaign this year. A lot of technicians, it was new to the platform. We tailored our inductions, our briefings, took guys physically up to the gangway, changed the induction video specific to what they were looking for, covering most of these points that we've seen up here around that. The feedback we got was very good. The guys certainly benefited from an enclosed gangway. They liked the feel of having the cage around them. I know some were open, they felt more secure. There was definitely no pressure on anybody to transfer. And it's all about building confidence with the guys as well, around the weather conditions and so on. The briefings we gave them, we got specific briefing from us and from the gangway operators at the same time. So all in the feedback was very, very positive for using a gangway for the walk to work.
Thanks, Neil. Just one question. In the factors you mentioned, I don't know whether there's a clear understanding among the people who are using these gangways, whether there is a clear distinction between what that structure has been designed to and what the safe operating limit for personal transfer. I don't know whether you have any comments on that.
Do you mean from a from a sort of human factors engineering? What is the limits of acceleration and velocity? Or?
No, just in terms of the environmental limits, wind, sea state, wind speed. So you have the structures designed for a particular sea state, wind speed and all. But in reality, what is actually, it's quite different probably for a safe transfer. That could be very different. I don't know whether there is a clear distinction and understanding of these limits among the operators.
Understood, yeah, thank you. Yeah, great question. So I think when you're designing a system and you're for a particular application, you can obviously do an assessment of the motions of the vessel, if you know which vessel it's going to be fitted on, motions of the vessel, the capability of the equipment to react to the motions that it'll be experiencing, and therefore you can kind of simulate what ideally would be its operating limits with regards wave height, wave period, wind speed, etc., which is kind of good in theory. In reality, of course, things are very different. But one of the key sort of design features of the equipment is to be able to show in real time how it's performing with where in its operating envelope it's working. So if it can give real-time information to the operator to say, hey, the system is now reaching, exceeding 80-90% of its operating limit, then that gives the information required for the operator to say, we need to stop transfer now, because being able to know what's happening in reality is, of course, much more powerful than trying to predict in advance through design and say, at 2 meter HS with a period of 6 seconds, you need to stop transfer. That's also firstly it's not accurate enough. That real-time monitoring is a really good facility, functionality for the equipment to have, and some systems have it and some don't. Thank you.
Right, maybe one more if there is one before we draw it to close. That's a good point on that last one, where we can work together as not just an industry for renewables, but industries across renewables and oil and gas, anywhere that these units might be used to come up with guidance to recommend what that operating limit is. For those that know me a bit better, you'll know that I've chaired the GOMO steering committee for years. There is an appetite within GOMO to have an operational section that is dealing with walk-to-work sort of operations. So aside from the design stuff that Jim's mentioned here, looking at the day-to-day use of that, in the same way that we have guidance within there that will recommend when, we would suggest when vessels should be looking at pulling off an installation based on the power usage of their engines when they're starting to go over that 45% sort of level. You can have a similar sort of flavour for gangway operations.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else, or move on? Right, thanks very much, Jim.
Thank you.
We are